visiting, I'm going to invite you to grab your seat. Wow, way to go. I'm not sure how that was going to go. Is that a mic? Good? Okay. Good morning. Welcome to Grace. As Charlie said, my name is John. It's a delight to get to be with you this morning as we continue our series in the book of Daniel, looking at it with this lens of what does the book of Daniel have to teach us about our jobs. And before we get into that this morning, I want you to think about a moment in your life where you have felt immense pressure, that you've been kind of put into decision-making, either relationally or in your actual work, where you've felt this pressure to go in a certain direction that maybe you don't want to go in. And that can be easy to think of just in personality differences of leadership and things like that. But can you think of a time in your life where you have felt that pressure and it's bared on you? It's weighed down on you. It's funny, as this week, as I was thinking about that, because this is very much going to connect to our topic this morning, I had this flashback, this memory that I actually forgot about. I think I just tucked it away and blocked it. But when I was in 8th grade, this might give you a little bit of a glimpse of a young John Turner. When I was in 8th grade, I was hanging out with two of my best friends, and at that time, airsoft guns were like a really big deal. They may still be, I'm not really sure. But and his parents, we were at my friend Grayson's house, and his parents were gone. Really not sure where they were. Maybe it was summertime and they were working, but we were at home, and we went to the back of their car to get the airsoft gun. And Grayson turns to me and to Jack, and just, it's like this light bulb moment where he's like, "Hey, do you want to go take my parents' car for a ride?" And Jack is like, "Oh, yeah." And I don't share this because it's a positive example for me. This is a rare moment for me. But in that moment, I saw two friends that were really all about this and like, let's go do this. And here I am sitting, and all I could think about, my dad's not here this morning, but all I could think about is like, my dad would absolutely kill me. And in that moment, I'm stuck kind of trying to decide between, am I going to like go with my friends, with the crowd, do something that, we're going to have a good time and who knows what might happen. But in that moment, by God's grace, my little 8th grade brain clicked in some way where I was like, this just isn't a good idea. I think I'm gonna leave this one out. And so I go inside the house, and again, in many moments, you can think about being a teenager. Peer pressure is a real thing. And that's probably like one of the only situations I can think about being a teenager where I didn't really go with the flow there. But I'm in the house. It felt like 30 minutes went by, and my buddy Jack runs in the door hysterical. And he's like, oh no, it's all he's saying, oh no. And I'm like, he is totally messing with me. And he's like, oh no, we hit a car. And in this moment, I'm like, thank goodness I was not in the car. But in all seriousness, I feel like I'm an accomplice. So here we are. They apparently hit a car and just like got so nervous. You should have seen the park job in front of the house. Like there was no doubt that they drove the car, and there was no doubt that they were the one responsible for hitting what was their neighbor's car. But so we kind of round up around the kitchen, and again, a bunch of 8th graders saying like, okay, what's our game plan? How are we going to get out of this? And of course, the logical solution was we're going to run away. I kid you not. This is like where we went. We left the house with the plan that we are running away. Now, the story goes on. Eventually, obviously, we didn't run away. Eventually, the parents show up, and it's a pretty easy connector of what happened. And there were some real consequences for them. But oddly enough, there was actually some consequences for me, too, in this friend group as I kind of made a decision that wasn't with them and with the flow, where there was like this small break, Like, here's my buddy who will walk with me through anything, Jack and Grayson. But John, can't really rely on him. He won't get in the car and play bumper cars with us in real life. And it is a silly story, but again, you think about that moment as an 8th grader feeling like, which way am I going to go? And the reality is that all of us, that if we're living into our identities, that if you're a follower of Jesus, your identity, Paul says, we are strangers, exiles, and aliens. That we have been called as exiles into our workplaces and into our neighborhoods to be God's representative. that there are going to be many moments that if we're actually living into that, many moments where you feel this tension, where you feel the pressure, when you feel it in your soul, that there's a decision to make here and there's going to be a consequence, but which way am I going to go? And this morning, I hope what this text does for us is gives us the resolve to in many ways be like the men that we see in this story who stand up regardless of the consequences. And so let's look at this text this morning, starting in, we're in Daniel chapter 3. And really, we're just going to kind of walk through this text and pull out some points from it. But at first, I want to look at the way that pressure mounts in Babylon, in their situation. These men who have been called as exiles into this kingdom of Babylon. And where the pressure begins to mount for them. So let's read here, picking up in 3, starting in verse 1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Take note of this setup language. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down, worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. It's a lot of repetition here, but the author is wanting to make sure we don't miss something. But before we address that, I think it's really important to realize that we're in chapter 3, which follows the end of chapter 2. And so if you were with us last week, Charlie gave an excellent sermon on talking about what this dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had that was troubling him, right? That Daniel ends up interpreting this dream as God gives him the vision and wisdom to do so. And what we learn is this dream is disturbing because this statue, which represented his kingdom, the king of Babylon, and these 3 other under it, which represent the kingdoms that will follow him, begin to be chipped away by this little stone. And Charlie talked about this, that the kingdom of God, much like a mustard seed, takes plant, but it is going to grow, and it is the only lasting kingdom in this world and on this earth. So we should work towards God's kingdom. And what's interesting is, if you remember at the end of this chapter, that King Nebuchadnezzar recognizes the glory of God. That in Daniel 21 and 22, he says, in praising Yahweh, he uses the same word that's often in this chapter, set up, but it's used towards God. It says this, that God is the one who sets up kings and kingdoms. And see, Nebuchadnezzar actually, at the end of the chapter, recognizes that. He says that it is your God, Daniel's God, who is the one who is really in control of all things. And yet here we are a few verses later, a few moments later, and King Nebuchadnezzar is building this grand statue for everybody to bow down to. And it does beg the question of what has happened so quickly where this recognition is no longer being lived into. And I couldn't help, before we think about how it is to be faithful in the fire, that for some of us, actually, we need to recognize the King Nebuchadnezzar in our heart. That very quickly, that often God is really gracious to us and shows us the moments, as Charlie addressed last week, where the kingdoms that we're building, right, that the solid ground of our work and our career and our family and our home and this thing that we're building, there's moments where God is really gracious to us and we see the crack in it. We see it begin to chip. And God wants us to realize that that is not an ultimate thing, that God's kingdom His is the lasting kingdom. And we are to respond in faith in that, and everything kind of falls into its correct order when that's the case. But often, very much like King Nebuchadnezzar, it's really quickly, a week's gone by, some of you don't even remember what last week's sermon was like. But we haven't actually moved and responded and maybe repented in some faith of the ways in which we have gone back to building our own king kingdom and us being the king. In 47 of chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar says this. It says, he answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and revealers of mystery, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. And I just was struck by the pronoun there, that ultimately the issue is that King Nebuchadnezzar never made that pronoun personal. He said, Daniel, you're God. And again, I think it's just a reminder that some of us are really easy and kind of quick to live out our faith through somebody else's faith. That we've seen somebody who really is living for God, that their God is the one that they are really moved and shaped, and it affects all their life, but we kind of have this secondhand knowledge, much like King Nebuchadnezzar. In Matthew 13, verses 18 through 23, some of you know that passage where it talks about the seed that is planted, and there's different things that happen that make that seed not take root. And ultimately, before we move into blasting through the fire, I just want to give somebody that reminder this morning that might be feeling that weight once again, that you really haven't, for some of us, even as Christians, we just haven't actually repented truly. Like truly turned and let go of some of the ways in which we are still moving and acting and living, that we are kings and we are living for our kingdom in our life. And so here's King Nebuchadnezzar in his effort to strengthen his kingdom. You know, he builds this image that all are to bow down to, but where we see the pressure mounting for our friends this morning is in this process. That if you look in verses 8 through 12, let's follow along as we hear of this pressure mounting for them. It says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. You see, they begin to feel this pressure acutely because they live in a culture much like ours. That in their culture, which was a polytheistic culture, there were many gods. It was okay to have lots of gods. In some ways, the more gods you had, the more protection that you had. And what King Nebuchadnezzar is ultimately saying through the ceremony is, I don't care the gods that you have privately. But in this space, in this public space, in my kingdom, we are all going to agree upon that we come, and when that music plays, we bow down to this idol. That he's trying to build this unity amongst his kingdom so that it does not crack. And again, the connection shouldn't be that hard for us to make, that we don't live, well, in some ways we do live still in a polytheistic culture, but we really live in a culture that is very pluralistic, right? That there is no more ultimate truth, that everybody can kind of have their truth. And the struggle for us as Christians is that we've been called as exiles into our workplaces, not simply just to blend in and make a living, but to actually be used by God for his kingdom purposes. And see, the pressure is going to be felt as we begin to live into that, because much like King Nebuchadnezzar, that we work under this assumption in our society that you can have your God at home, but when it comes to the public place, it's not, just kind of leave that private and personal, and let's not bring that into here. I was blown away by this. One of my buddies this Friday, I was talking to him actually, and he works in commercial real estate, and he told me this story where he said, the guy that hired me, and first conversation he had with me, he didn't know my friend's faith. He said, hey, listen, he said, I'm a very devout and strong Jewish person. I want you to respect my faith. I respect whatever faith you have. Let's leave it at that. I don't want you really bringing it up or talking about it much here. And again, this was the guy that hired him and essentially kind of made it clear, like, hey, look, I respect you, you respect me, let's leave it at that, and let's do our job. And I heard that, and again, that's a respectful way to say that, but ultimately he was put in that place very early of basically saying, well, gosh, if I ever speak up or move out in my faith in some sort of way, now does that bode some consequences with my boss, with my job, right? That as a young 22-year-old, that you begin to hear that, and what begins to happen is you navigate your work and you do your job well, which is part of being a faithful Christian. But the component of actually standing up and sticking out when the consequences are laid before you to do so, it becomes really, really hard to do that. And see, our friends this morning, they begin to feel that pressure. That, as I said, the spirit of Babylon is alive and well in our culture today, right? That we agree upon these things. Tolerance, no capital T, truth. Everybody has to figure out who they are, their identity, internally within themselves. And that begins to chip away at our confidence and our courage to actually stand up where God has called us to stand up. There's a slide up here. I'm not sure you'll be able to see it. It's an image of this research done by Barna Study, which they do a lot of incredible studies. And this one I found to be really compelling. And unless you have unbelievable eyesight, there's no chance you can see that. But this bottom one basically talks about how do you feel about sharing your faith. If someone disagrees, it is wrong, the second to last one says, it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith. Now, this is to Christians, and that topic here is to millennials, which I think I fall into. And basically the question is it wrong to share your faith hoping that someone is going to turn and believe what you believe to be true? 47% answered yes. There's other generations represented where you can see it begin to double. And what's interesting is Gen Z is not in this, and many would say that is only going to grow with Gen Z. And I think it's probably easy to sit back for some of you to hear that and be like, well, how could you believe that? But there's also some complexities here where we're more connected. We live in a much more pluralistic society than we ever have. That actually millennials and Gen Z and more know a lot more people in their life that believe different things in them. 4 to 5 per person is what kind of the average in this study means, which is not true for many Christians of the past, kind of in a nation that was seemingly Christian. And the article says this, that sharing the gospel today is made harder than at any other time in recent memory by an overall cultural resistance to conversations that highlight people's differences. We kind of want to stay away from that. We want to find where we are bound together in unity, especially in the workplace. But where we have conversations that highlight our differences are really, really hard to have. And so the first thing I just want to ask is, what does it look like to be a man or a woman who navigates the pressures of this pluralistic society as distinctly Christian? Because we are called to, and we're going to continue to see in this story the way that they respond as such. But what does it look like to not cave in or to blend in, not always just fall in the background, but actually step into those places? And I love this analogy, but Tim Keller will kind of talk about the ways in which we are called to contextualize the gospel, which simply just means how do we take the message of the good news of Jesus and make it and connect to those in present situations. Missionaries do this all the time, right? That the way in which they go live in a place and communicate the gospel might be different, although the message, the core is the same. But how you share the gospel with a teenager versus how you share it with somebody, who's 70 is going to be different, and it should, and that takes contextualization. But he gives this image, and he says, consider that you're driving down a highway, and you're trying to build basically this highway up a mountain, and there's a big boulder in the way. And he says, well, the way that you build that is you've got to drill down a deep hole, and then once you drill that deep hole, you've got to drop in a dynamite so that you can blow up from the center and get the boulder out of the way. And what he says that often people kind of fall in two spectrums when it comes to, whether sharing their faith or being loud about their faith or wanting to live out their faith in these tough situations. That one, many people really want to do the drilling, which we might compare to being somebody that becomes relatable, right? You build the relationship, you care for someone, you be a good friend, you be a good worker in your workplace. That's a way of drilling and actually connecting in a way where now you have an opportunity to maybe share what you believe or share a hard truth or speak up when a hard situation happens. But he says some often do the drilling really well, but they leave out the dynamite part. There's no boulder moving there. And that at some point, this is where it comes, I think this probably speaks a lot more to my generation and others, but I think we can all feel this, that at some point, just only trying to preach the gospel with our actions is not enough. But then there's this other side of the category, and we know these people, right? These are the ones that can kind of be brash and bold. You might be careful sitting next to them at a family gathering at a dinner table because they're really good at the dynamite part, right? That they can just like hit the hard truth or say the hard things and he basically compares that to slapping the dynamite on top of the boulder, having never drilled. And what you just end up doing is chipping the face of the boulder, and it doesn't do anything either. It's not effective. And I think this illustration is helpful because, both are needed. And sometimes we might be more gifted in one or the other, but this is why as a body we live into our calling together, not separate. But we also need to be grown and stretched in the areas where we're not as comfortable to be stretched in. That some of us actually, the call might be, you have found yourself in so many fires like Daniel kind of unnecessarily because you're just a dynamite. But for some, you've found yourself in a workplace situation where you've wondered if this is the place for me to speak up or to actually live out my faith in a way that is going to cause some consequences. But you just kind of want to keep drilling. You want to kind of go with the flow. You want people to look at you and respect you well so that maybe they would be moved by your faith. But you never step in those moments to kind of show the difference of your faith and what it makes. That we need both of these things. I think of somebody that we sat with, Charlie and I, this week, who have been coming to the church and want to consider joining. And I was really moved as the person talked about the job and the industry that they're in, that it's kind of an industry that is really hard to live out your faith in. It demands a lot of time. Most that are in it are not kind of love the idea of that Jesus is the only way, or that, this capital T truth that we talk about. And they begin to feel that if I continue to work at this capacity in this way, that something is going to happen in my life and going to give. And so what am I going to do? And I loved hearing them talk about the ways in which they had to make a hard decision that was going to cost a consequence, career-oriented wise, where not to change their career, but have to make some real solid boundaries in their career so that they can continue to be a person of faith and to actually not just be watered down and drowned out. And I've heard of another story, actually, of a person in our congregation that this small group, this job that they took, they were aware that he was a Christian and kind of began to become the butt end of some jokes. And there was an issue that took place kind of in their business model. And because he was kind of this ostracized guy on the outside who they knew what his faith was, he kind of took the fall for it. And it was actually a real serious consequence where a job was lost over it. But in many ways, it was because of his faith, not even because of anything he did. And all of these stories, and you can think about some of your own, and as we think about this story in this chapter of Daniel, they ultimately were willing to take the consequences because they were so sure of their conviction. They drilled well, right? We know this. They knew that to work for the good of Babylon was actually what God had called them to do. But that at certain moments, they had to stand in contrast to that. And this was the moment for them. And I wonder what we would do. When the situations arises, when you feel that tension, what's kind of your natural reaction? Navigators is a wonderful ministry on a lot of college campuses, and in their book of Daniel kind of study, I thought this was fascinating. They are walking through the story, and then they kind of have this snippet where they say, think about the excuses that Daniel, Shadrach, and Abednego could have made. And they kind of list them out, right? That as they are asked to worship this idol, right, that in their core identity, who they were, the God of the Bible, first 10 commandments, 2 of them cover this exact situation where they're not to bow to idols and they're not to worship any other gods. So the tension's felt. But think about the excuses, and I want us to kind of think about where we might fall into this, because this actually helped me think about it. It says, first, they maybe think, we'll bow down, but we won't actually worship. Look, when the music plays, we'll do the part, but we're not in our heart of hearts going to worship. Consequence diverted. Or we won't become idol worshipers, but we'll do it this one time, and then we'll ask for forgiveness. That checks one for me. The king, here's another one. The king has absolute power, and we must obey him. Surely God will understand. Or maybe the king has appointed us. He's hired us. We owe this to him. Or this is a foreign land, so God will forgive us for following the customs of the land. That God has picked us up and put us here, and I mean, we have to follow the land. We have to follow the laws. Or finally, no one's being hurt by this, so what does it really matter? And again, I think that's helpful because often we can be quick to go to excuses when God has actually called us in a moment to stand courageously and boldly, despite the consequences. And I was praying with Judy Becker this week, and she mentioned that in her community group, she kind of gave this charge to some people who, just trying to navigate, like, how can I really be more faithful in my workplace, right? How can I work towards God's kingdom, or how can I stand when the fire comes? And Judy's wonderful, and she said, how can you expect to do this if you're not on your knees starting your day, recognizing who is king of your life and who is the ruler over all things? That she kind of told me this thing called the 3-minute prayer challenge, and I actually really do offer this morning as one way that you might be able to live into this. But before you go to work, you lay before your king. Judy said she's going to lay prostrate. She's about to have knee surgery or hip surgery. And her concern was she wanted to know, doctor, when can I lay before God in prayer in the morning? But I love the image that not bowing to the idol or the temptation or the things in this world, but to get on your knees before the day starts, before you head into work, and to recognize that God is in control, that you are in his kingdom. But she fleshed it out a little bit, and I love it. Like a thing that you could do if you don't really know or what to pray is pray through your day, your schedule, the meetings that you have, the things that you have on your plate. But when we begin to give those to God in recognition that he is the great one over all of it, it does begin to do a work in us. It recalls for who we really work for and who's in control and who's walking with us and working in and through us. We all can do this, but the reality is that you're not going to stumble into faithfulness. But I think for many of us, we just assume when the moment comes, I'm going to stumble into it, and that's just not true. It takes this muscle being worked, and I think this 3-minute challenge alone could be something that would be huge for us as a people. But nearing towards our chapter, if you look at verse 16, we need to be aware that when we stick up, when we stick our neck out, there will be a price to pay. If you look at 16, I'll skip over the first few verses before 16, but just so you know, King Nebuchadnezzar hears this thing, that there's these 3 guys who are not bowing down. And he's furious, it says, and he goes to them, and essentially he's like, well, maybe they just didn't hear me well enough. Hey, listen, if you don't bow when the music plays, I'm going to tear you limb from limb. And listen to their response in verse 16. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, and in the NIV I actually like it better, it says, but even if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up. Unbelievable, courage and boldness. And it says in verse 19 that then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it is usually heated, which I'm like, a furnace is hot. What does 7 more times do? But he's that mad. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. These men paid a dear consequence for sticking their neck out. But the courage in which they stood before a king, and I think it's worth noting here, they didn't respond to the king in arrogance or bombastic or looking for a challenge or a fight. What they ultimately said was, the God I serve and who I live for has a direct thing to say about this, and I can't do it. If I have to choose, I'm going to follow God versus following you. But they're not antagonistic. They're not looking for a fight. There's still salt and grace and kindness, even in the way they remain faithful. And ultimately, as we think about how do they respond in a way such as this, I was reminded Knox right now is into this book. Maybe some of you know it. We're going on a bear hunt. This is like, we've read many books, and there's a lot of books he loves, and it's really funny, but this book has like gotten like in his mind and in his heart, like he thinks he's going on a bear hunt. And the song has caught him, the words have caught him, and again, I mean, it's pretty silly, but it's this family that's like, we're going on a bear hunt. We're gonna catch a big one. And it says, we're not scared, is kind of the line. And then they come up against an obstacle. So like the first one I think is like tall grass. And the second one's water. And the third one's like a snowstorm and a forest, mud, whatever. But each obstacle they come to, they basically come up to it and they say, oh no, it's mud. And there's this line that we can't go over it. We can't go under it. We've got to go through it. And Knox like loves it. It's really a sweet thing, but can I tell you how theologically rich that is? I would probably imagine that it wasn't a Christian that wrote it. Maybe so, but this is wonderful theology when it comes to consequences and the fire and the furnaces that we will face for sticking our neck out. That God says you and I cannot go over it and we cannot go under it. We've got to go through it. That ultimately these men, the way that they could do this is because they had dropped their anchor in the character of God. Not in the circumstances of their life. They say it, that look, even if God does not deliver it, we believe he can. But if he doesn't from the situation, we're still going through it because they trusted the heart of the king. If you drop your anchor into that, we can be people who stand tall when the moment comes that God has called us to have a firm and steel back. But if it's because of circumstances and situations in the moment, we won't do it because often there will be a price to pay. And it's to that point into the bear hunt book where ultimately it's actually that they're delivered through the fire. They're sent to the furnace. It's heated up. You know, it's interesting if you, I think I'm not sure if I read it or not. Oh, yeah. "22 says, I'm not sure if I read this, but it says, because the king's order was so urgent and the furnace was overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. But he answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the fourth is like the son of God's. I think this is so fascinating that he's worked up so much in his anger that the men who actually throw them into the fire, they die from the heat of the flames. And again, it just reminds me of the ways in which Jesus says, for those that want to actually find their life, they must lose it. But for those who try to save it, you will lose it. And often as we follow the orders of the world and we fall in line, that it's actually much like illustrated in this. It will kill us. It will deaden our souls. It will make us less of a witness on behalf of Jesus. And what we end up seeing is that they are delivered through the fire. And where I want to land here is in this comment that he makes, talking about the man that he sees, the 4th person in the fire. That there's a lot of debate about this, that, some believe it's just an angel of the Lord. Some believe that it's a Christophany, an appearance of Jesus prior to his coming in the New Testament, that ultimately he sees this 4th in the fire. And this is what propels us forward, that what we see, that as God looked out on the issue of the world, people created in his image that have found themselves in sin, in mud and mire and muck, following the kingdoms of this world, that God looked out and he said, I'm going to make a way, and it is going to come through the fire. It is going to come through death, and it's going to be the death of my son, Jesus Christ. You see, precisely, Jesus went into the fire, into death. He took the wrath of God on for us so that we might never have to question the love of God for us, even though the consequences might come. And I think it's that last point that is so important for us, because ultimately what we begin to see in the Bible is that God actually does not take us over or under. He takes us right through the fire. But the promise for the Christian is that God is with you, that he will not leave you and he will not forsake you. Emmanuel, God with us. that we know that to be a reality and a truth. And as we are people that begin to embrace and live into this calling as exiles in our place, God will make us effective, and there will be moments where we feel the pressure. And I hope that we might be able to have some courage and make some tough decisions to be able to walk in that, not just with our words and actions, but both. Let's go to the table this morning as we reflect on Jesus' death in our behalf. Father, we are grateful for your word that we believe is alive and active, and as we gather here, that we find ourselves in different moments and different seasons, and we might be compelled in different ways as we hear your word preached and proclaimed and read. But what I know to be true this morning is that everybody in this room, God has called them and placed them to be salt, to be light, to be exiles, strangers, and aliens, to drill deeply, to love their neighbors, to be kind. But in moments, God, a situation will arise where they need to move forward in their faith, even though consequence will come. I'm thankful, God, that we have a God who is so with us that we don't have to wonder or worry or be afraid. If you'll meet us in that place, we know it to be true because of your Son, Jesus Christ. And so I pray that you would strengthen us this morning, that we would be people like Daniel, Shadrach, and Abednego, God, not looking for these opportunities to ruffle feathers, God, but when it comes, we're willing and able to step in because of the faithfulness of God on our behalf. We pray and ask this in the strong and powerful name of Jesus. And on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he gathered with his friends, and before breaking bread,